Welcome, dear listener. There is something deeply unsettling about a mirror that has been shattered on purpose. Not dropped, not cracked by accident, but broken, deliberately, violently, as if someone needed to destroy the reflection itself. And there is something equally unsettling about a flower, left not as a gift, but as a message. A narcissus, pale, delicate, almost innocent in appearance, crushed beneath a heel and placed where only one person would truly understand what it meant. This is not a story about a crime of passion, though passion is woven through every corner of it. This is a story about vanity, about rivalry, about the kind of hatred that grows slowly in the dark, the way certain flowers do, until one day it blooms into something irreversible. Our story takes us to London. The year is 1952. The curtain has just fallen on the West End's most celebrated actress, Vivian Ashcroft, not in applause, but in silence. The permanent kind. And it falls to one man to make sense of it all. A man who is tired, who is getting older, who sometimes misses things the first time around, but whose little grey cells, as he himself would say, have never truly let him down. Hercule Poirot. If you enjoy mysteries that breathe, stories that take their time, that trust you to pay attention, then you are in exactly the right place. Subscribe to the channel. Stay with us. The curtain is about to rise. For the very last time, the last curtain call. The Criterion Theatre on a wet November evening was, in Hercule Poirot's private opinion, one of the more bearable places London had to offer. He did not particularly care for theatre. The dramatics of the stage had always struck him as somewhat excessive. People throwing themselves about, weeping at volumes that would alarm a neighbour, declaring love and hatred with equal ferocity within the span of 2 hours. Real human beings in Poirot's experience were far more subtle in their destructions. They smiled while they plotted. They sent flowers while they hated. They said good evening to the very person they intended to ruin before the week was out. Still, he had come tonight at the invitation of his old acquaintance, Chief Inspector Barnaby of Scotland Yard, who had 2 tickets he could not use, and a wife who had declared she was done attending anything that ended after 10 o'clock. "Take them, Poirot," Barnaby had said over the telephone that afternoon, his voice carrying the particular weariness of a man who had learned to choose his battles carefully. "The show is supposed to be quite something. That Ashcroft woman is in it. You know the one. Always in the papers." Poirot did know the one. Vivian Ashcroft. The name alone carried a certain weight in London's cultural circles. She was, by most accounts, the finest actress of her generation. A woman who could make an audience weep during the first act and forget their own names by the third. The critics adored her. The public worshipped her, and Vivian Ashcroft, from everything Poirot had observed and read, accepted this worship as nothing less than her natural due. He had seen her photographed many times, in the Times, in the Illustrated London News, occasionally on the covers of magazines that his housekeeper left, about the flat with what he suspected was deliberate intention. In every photograph, Vivian Ashcroft looked precisely the same. Not merely beautiful, though she was certainly that, but aware of her beauty. Consciously, carefully, almost architecturally aware. Her chin always at the same slight angle. Her eyes always carrying that particular expression that managed to suggest both vulnerability and absolute command simultaneously. It was, Poirot thought, quite a feat. The theatre itself was full that evening. Every seat occupied, every box taken, with the air thick with perfume and cigarette smoke, and the low murmur of an audience that had dressed for the occasion. Poirot settled into his seat in the fourth row. Excellent seats, he acknowledged. Barnaby had done well, and unfolded his program with the neat, precise movements that characterized everything he did. The Gilded Cage, the program announced in elegant gold lettering. A drama in 3 acts, starring Vivian Ashcroft as Eleanor Vane. He read through the cast list with the habitual attention he gave to most documents, however trivial. It was a practice so deeply ingrained that he could no more skip it than he could leave his flat without ensuring his mustaches were perfectly symmetrical. The supporting cast was respectable. Is Marcus Hale as the male lead, a broad-shouldered man with a reliable reputation, and no great surprises. Dorothy Sims in the secondary female role, a younger actress whom the program described as a rising talent of considerable promise. A handful of supporting players whose names Poirot noted and filed away in the orderly cabinets of his memory without any particular expectation of needing them again. The lights dimmed. The murmur of the audience softened and then ceased entirely, the way a tide pulls back before something arrives. And then Vivian Ashcroft walked onto the stage. Poirot would admit, later and only to himself, that she was remarkable. There was no other word that quite fit. She entered not with the careful, measured steps of someone who had rehearsed an entrance, though she had, without question, rehearsed it extensively, but with the absolute ease of a woman who had never in her life doubted that every eye in a room would find her. And they did. Every eye in the Criterion Theatre found Vivian Ashcroft within the first 3 seconds of her appearance, and did not willingly look away for the remainder of the act. She was perhaps 38, though certain profiles Poirot had read suggested she preferred not to confirm this. Tall, with dark hair swept up in the style of the period, and a face that the stage lights treated with extraordinary generosity, all sharp angles and deep shadows, and those remarkable eyes that seemed to change color depending on where she stood. She wore a deep red gown that someone had clearly designed specifically for her, for no one else could have worn it in quite that way. Her voice, which when she spoke her first lines, filled the theatre without effort. Poirot found himself, despite his reservations about theatre as an art form, entirely attentive. The play itself was competent rather than brilliant, a drawing-room drama concerning a woman trapped between duty and desire, with the expected complications involving letters, misunderstandings, and a third-act revelation that Poirot had identified with reasonable confidence somewhere in the middle of the second. But it did not matter that the play was merely competent, because Vivian Ashcroft elevated everything around her simply by being present within it. He noticed, however, certain things that had nothing to do with the drama unfolding on stage. He noticed that Dorothy Sims, the younger actress, watched Vivian during scenes they shared together with an expression that was not quite admiration and not quite resentment, but something uncomfortable, living in the space between the two. He noticed that the stage manager, a thin, anxious man visible occasionally in the wings, tracked Vivian's movements with the vigilance of someone accustomed to managing unpredictability. He noticed that Marcus Hale, despite his professional competence, seemed to shrink very slightly whenever Vivian was within arm's reach of him, as if proximity to that much certainty was its own kind of pressure. These were small things, probably meaningless. Poirot filed them away regardless, because that was what his mind did with small things, collected them quietly and waited to see whether they became relevant. During the interval, he drank a cup of tea that was too weak and too hot, stood near the lobby window watching the rain against the glass, and thought about nothing in particular. The second and third acts confirmed his earlier assessments. The play resolved itself in the expected fashion. The audience applauded with the genuine warmth of people who felt they had received good value for their evening. Vivian Ashcroft took her curtain call with the grace of someone performing an act of generosity rather than receiving one, bowing just deeply enough, holding the pause just long enough, releasing the audience from her attention at precisely the right moment. She was, Poirot thought, a woman who understood power very well. He collected his coat and hat from the cloakroom and was making his way toward the exit when he heard the first scream. It came from somewhere backstage, high, sharp, and carrying within it a quality that Poirot had learned, over many years and many investigations, to distinguish immediately from other kinds of screaming. There was the scream of surprise, the scream of pain, the scream of grief. And then there was the scream that meant someone had found something that could not be unfound. This was the last kind. The lobby, which had been emptying in the orderly fashion of a well-behaved London audience, went very still. People looked at one another with the particular expression of those who hope they have misheard. A woman near the door clutched her companion's arm. A man in evening dress said, "I say," in a tone that suggested this did not adequately cover the situation, but was the best he could manage on short notice. Poirot did not go toward the exit, but he turned, with the careful deliberateness of a man who already suspected what he would find, and moved toward the sound. The door to the backstage corridor was being held open by a young stagehand who had gone the color of old newspaper. Beyond him, the narrow passage stretched toward the dressing rooms, and from somewhere at its end came the sound of a woman crying. Not the theatrical crying of the stage, but the helpless, breathless kind that has no audience and no performance in it at all. Poirot straightened his jacket, set his hat under his arm, and walked forward into the backstage dark. Behind him, the theatre lights were still on. Ahead of him, something waited that no curtain call would ever follow: the shattered glass. The dressing room of Vivian Ashcroft was the third door on the left of the backstage corridor, and Poirot knew it was hers before he reached it, not because of any particular deductive brilliance, but because her name was printed on a small card slotted into a brass holder on the door, the letters done in a font that suggested whoever had printed it understood that Vivian Ashcroft was not a woman who accepted plain signage. The door was open, not ajar, fully open, pushed back against the wall as if someone had gone through it in a hurry, or come out of it in a hurry. Poirot noted the distinction without yet knowing which it was. He paused at the threshold. In his long career, he had stood at the entrance to many rooms that contained terrible things, and he had learned that the first few seconds at a threshold were among the most valuable of any investigation, before the room was disturbed. Before well-meaning people moved things and touched surfaces, and altered the precise arrangement that a crime scene presented to whoever was paying attention. In those first seconds, if you were the right kind of person, the kind whose eyes moved in the correct order and whose mind did not rush toward conclusion before observation was complete, a room could tell you a great deal. Poirot was very much that kind of person. He stood at the threshold of Vivian Ashcroft's dressing room and looked. The room was not large. Dressing rooms at the Criterion, even for its principal performers, were functional rather than luxurious. A long mirror bordered by electric lights is a dressing table crowded with the architecture of a professional actress's preparation. A clothing rail along one wall, heavy with costumes about. a small settee against the opposite wall, and a single chair before the mirror. Vivian Ashcroft was in the chair. She was still wearing the deep red gown from the final act, and from a distance of perhaps 6 feet, she might almost have appeared to be sitting quietly, resting after the exertions of performance, her head tilted very slightly to one side, in an attitude of repose, but she was not resting. The stillness about her was of the absolute, irreversible kind, and Poirot, who had seen death in many forms across many decades, recognized it without needing to move any closer. The particular quality of a body from which life has departed is not easily described, but it is unmistakable, and it announced itself now with quiet certainty. Vivian Ashcroft was dead. The woman who had screamed was standing pressed against the far wall of the corridor, a few feet back from the open door. A small, round-faced woman of perhaps 50, wearing the plain black dress of a dresser or personal attendant, with her hands clasped tightly together at her chest, as if she were attempting to hold herself in one piece by sheer will. Her eyes were fixed on the middle distance with the glassy concentration of someone whose mind has temporarily removed itself from its surroundings as a protective measure. A young constable had materialized from somewhere and was standing beside her with the helpless solicitousness of a person who has been trained to manage situations but has not yet been trained to manage this particular kind of situation. Poirot addressed the woman gently. "Madam," he said, "I am Hercule Poirot. I am not with the police, not officially, you understand, but I have some experience in these matters. Can you tell me your name?" The woman blinked, focused on him with some effort. "Edith," she said. Her voice was the voice of someone speaking from a considerable distance. "Edith Marsh. I was Miss Ashcroft's dresser. 10 years, nearly 11. You found her." "I knocked at 10:30, Edith Marsh said, as if reciting something she had already told herself several times in an attempt to make it orderly. She always wanted her tea at 10:30 after the show. She was particular about it. Earl Grey, not too strong, the cup warmed first. I knocked and there was no answer, and I thought perhaps she'd stepped out. But the door wasn't locked. It was just open a little, so I—" She stopped. "You went in," Poirot said quietly. "Yes." He did not press her further on that point. The police arrived 11 minutes later. Poirot counted from habit, in the form of Detective Sergeant Welch, a competent, methodical man in his mid-40s whom Poirot had encountered twice before on the periphery of other matters, and 2 uniformed constables who immediately began the business of securing the corridor and redirecting the theatre staff, who had begun to congregate with the irresistible pull of people drawn toward catastrophe. Welch took one look at Poirot, standing near the dressing-room door, and had the expression of a man who has ordered a straightforward cup of coffee and been presented with something considerably more complicated. "Mr. Poirot," he said. "Detective Sergeant," Poirot replied pleasantly. "I was in the audience this evening. I happened to be nearby when the body was discovered. I have touched nothing." Welch absorbed this with the resignation of a professional. "Chief Inspector Barnaby will want to speak with you." "Naturally. I shall make myself available." In the meantime, Poirot gestured toward the open door with a slight inclination of his head. "You will want to look carefully at what is on the dressing table, and at the floor directly in front of it." Welch looked at him for a moment, then went in. Poirot, who had already observed what he needed to observe from the threshold, and had spent the intervening 11 minutes thinking about it with considerable attention, now permitted himself to follow. The dressing table was the heart of the room. It was, as such, tables belonging to actresses of Vivian Ashcroft's standing tend to be, extensively populated, jars and bottles arranged with the systematic logic of a woman who knew precisely where everything lived. Brushes and pencils sorted by purpose, a small vase that had contained flowers and now lay on its side with a spreading dark stain of water across the wooden surface, the flowers themselves scattered. The mirror was shattered, not merely cracked, not the single fracture of an accidental impact, but broken comprehensively, from a point roughly at head height, the cracks radiating outward in every direction with the violent geometry of something struck hard and deliberately. Several larger pieces had fallen onto the dressing table and lay among the scattered bottles and brushes. Smaller fragments caught the electric light and threw it back in sharp, cold angles. Poirot looked at the broken mirror for a long time. Then he looked at the floor. At his feet, or rather at Vivian Ashcroft's feet, for they had fallen there, lay a single flower, a narcissus, white-petaled, with the characteristic pale yellow corona at its center. It had been, at some point recently, a perfectly formed specimen, the kind one might purchase from a decent florist, fresh and carefully chosen. It was now crushed. Not casually, not as if it had been dropped and accidentally trodden upon, but deliberately and thoroughly, as if someone had placed it on the floor and pressed their heel into it with intention. Poirot crouched, with somewhat more care and somewhat more audible effort than he might once have managed, a fact he acknowledged privately and without particular distress, and studied the crushed flower without touching it. He stayed in that position for almost a full minute. When he straightened up, Welch was watching him from across the room with the expression of a man who wants to ask a question, but is not entirely sure he wants to hear the answer. "Well," Welch said. Poirot looked once more at the broken mirror, at the overturned vase, at Vivian Ashcroft sitting perfectly still in her chair in her red gown, her remarkable eyes now fixed on nothing at all. Then he looked at the crushed narcissus on the floor. This, Poirot said quietly, was not a robbery. It was not a sudden quarrel that went too far. And that flower, he paused, that flower was not left by accident, and it was most certainly not left with affection. Welch waited. Someone, Poirot said, wished Vivian Ashcroft to know, in her final moments, exactly what they thought of her. And they wished her to understand why. He picked up his hat from where he had set it on the edge of the settee. Which means, he added almost to himself, that this is not simply a murder. It is a message. And messages, mon ami, always have a sender. Shadows behind the spotlight. Chief Inspector Barnaby arrived at 20 minutes past 11, still wearing his evening clothes beneath his overcoat, which suggested he had been at some function or another when the call came through. He was a large, solid man with the kind of face that had been weathered by 30 years of London police work into something that expressed very little, unless he specifically intended it to express something. And he greeted Poirot in the narrow backstage corridor with the particular mixture of genuine warmth and professional wariness that had characterized their relationship for the better part of 2 decades. "Of all the theatres in London," Barnaby said. "And yet here we both are," Poirot replied. They shook hands. Barnaby looked through the open dressing-room door at the scene within, and something moved briefly across his weathered face before he put it away again. "Welch has briefed me," he said. "Cause of death looks like strangulation. The police surgeon will confirm. No sign of forced entry, no sign of a struggle beyond the mirror. She was found by her dresser at 10:30. Yes," Poirot said. "I have spoken with Edith Marsh. She is a reliable witness, I think, despite the shock. The door was not locked when she arrived, which suggests either that the killer left in haste, and did not think to lock it, or that the killer had no key to lock it with, and was therefore not someone who belonged in that room by right. Barnaby looked at him. Or, he said, the door was simply not locked because Vivian Ashcroft had not locked it herself yet. She'd only just come off stage. Poirot considered this. Also possible, he admitted, with the slight inclination of the head that signified genuine concession rather than mere politeness. You see, this is why I find your company useful, mon ami. You remind me not to discard the simple explanation before I have properly examined it. Barnaby made a sound that might have been acknowledgement, or might have been skepticism, and turned to survey the corridor. Theatre staff had been gathered at the far end, perhaps a dozen people in various states of costume and distress, held there by the uniformed constables with the collective air of people who have been told to wait and are finding the waiting considerably more difficult than the telling. I need to speak with all of them, Barnaby said. As do I, said Poirot, with your permission, naturally. Barnaby gave him a long look. Just then, don't touch anything. I never do, Poirot said, which was not entirely true, but was true enough for present purposes. They began with the theatre's director, a man named Gerald Foss. Foss was 60, or near enough to it that the difference did not matter. A lean, angular man with the slightly distracted manner of someone whose mind was accustomed to operating on several levels simultaneously. He had been in the theatre business for 35 years, he told them, and had known Vivian Ashcroft for the better part of 20. He sat in the green room, with his hands wrapped around a cup of tea he had not drunk, and answered their questions with the careful precision of a man who understood that precision was currently important. She arrived at the theatre at 5 o'clock, Foss said, her usual time, and she was always punctual. Whatever else one might say about Vivienne, she was never late. And what else might one say about Vivienne? Poirot asked pleasantly. Foss looked at him, with the expression of a man who recognizes a question shaped like a casual remark. She was, he paused, choosing carefully, a woman of considerable talent and considerable demands. The two tend to travel together in this profession. She knew what she was worth, and she expected to be treated accordingly. That created friction, occasionally, with other cast members, with production staff, with me on certain occasions. Recent occasions. Foss set down his cup. We had a disagreement last week about the staging of the third act. She felt the blocking diminished her. I felt it served the play. These things happen. And how did the disagreement resolve itself? The way they always resolve themselves with Vivian, Foss said, with a tiredness that suggested long familiarity. Her way. Poirot nodded slowly. He looked at the untouched tea. He looked at Gerald Foss's hands, which were steady. He looked at the man's face, which was unhappy in the genuine, uncomplicated way of someone who has lost something they valued, even if that something was also, on occasion, a considerable source of frustration. He did not think Gerald Foss had killed Vivian Ashcroft. He noted this privately and moved on. Dorothy Sims was a different matter entirely. She was 26. Poirot had confirmed this from the program, with a quality of restrained energy about her that reminded him of something coiled. Not hostile precisely, not nervous, precisely. Something that lived in the space between the two and had learned to present itself as composure. She had changed out of her costume into a plain grey dress and sat with her hands folded in her lap, with the stillness of someone who has decided that stillness is the safest available option. Miss Sims, Poirot began, you were in the cast with Miss Ashcroft for... How long has this production been running? 6 weeks, Dorothy said. Her voice was carefully neutral. "We opened in the first week of October. And your relationship with Miss Ashcroft during those 6 weeks?" A pause, brief but present. "Professional," Dorothy said. "Of course," Poirot said agreeably. "And personally?" Another pause, slightly longer. "We were not friends," Dorothy said. "I don't think Vivian had friends in the cast particularly. She had people in orbit around her. That was more her style. And were you in orbit, Miss Sims?" Something moved behind Dorothy's composed expression. "I was in the same production, that's all." Poirot regarded her for a moment with the mild, unhurried attention that people frequently found more unsettling than direct interrogation. "You watched her very carefully during the performance this evening," he said. "I observed this from the 4th row. It is interesting, no? The way one watches someone. There is the watching of admiration. There is the watching of study, one performer learning from another. And there is another kind of watching entirely." Dorothy Sims met his gaze steadily. "She was the lead," she said. "We all watched her." "Naturellement," Poirot said pleasantly, and wrote nothing in his small notebook, because he had not brought his small notebook this evening and was making do with his memory, which was, he reminded himself, entirely adequate for the purpose. He thanked her and let her go, but he watched her leave with the same careful attention she had denied giving to Vivian Ashcroft, and he thought about the expression he had seen on her face during the 2nd act, that particular expression that was not admiration and not resentment, but something uncomfortable in the territory between. Marcus Hale, the male lead, was cooperative, distressed, and in Poirot's assessment, largely uninvolved. He was 42, broad and fair, and genuinely shaken in the uncomplicated way of a decent man confronted with something indecent. He had liked Vivian, he said, in the way one likes a force of nature, with respect and a certain amount of healthy caution. He had no quarrel with her. He had spoken with her briefly before the show, in the usual way, and had not seen her after the curtain call, because he had gone directly to his own dressing room on the other side of the building. "Did she seem different tonight?" Poirot asked. "Before the performance? Her manner? Was it as usual?" Hale considered this with genuine attention. "She was quieter than normal, I suppose. Vivian was usually quite present before a show. Very in the room, if you know what I mean. Tonight, she seemed distracted, somewhere else in her head." "Did she say anything that struck you as unusual?" "She said," Hale paused, frowning slightly. "She said something odd when I passed her in the corridor around 6:30. I didn't think anything of it at the time. She said, 'Some people never stop, Marcus. Even when you think it's finished, they never stop.' I assumed she meant a critic or a journalist. Vivienne had her share of enemies in the press." Poirot was very still for a moment. "Those were her exact words?" "As near as I can recall, yes." Poirot thanked him and stood and walked to the window of the green room that looked out onto the rain-wet alley behind the theatre, and stood there for a moment, looking at nothing in particular. Some people never stop. Even when you think it's finished, they never stop. He turned this over carefully in his mind, the way one turns over a stone to examine what lives beneath it. It was not nothing. It was, in point of fact, rather a great deal, if one knew how to listen to it properly. But he did not yet know how to listen to it properly. This bothered him more than he would have admitted to Barnaby, or to anyone else. There was a shape forming at the edge of his understanding, not yet visible, not yet nameable, but present. The way a figure becomes visible in fog, not all at once but gradually, emerging from the grey as you moved toward it. He needed more. The last interview of the evening was with a man Poirot had not initially intended to speak with at all. Thomas Greer was the theatre's head stagehand, a compact, quiet man of perhaps 45, with the hands of someone who worked with them daily, and the eyes of someone who noticed things without necessarily advertising the fact. He had been pointed out to Poirot by Edith Marsh, and who had mentioned in passing that Thomas had been near the backstage corridor earlier in the evening. "Near the corridor," Poirot said, "or in it?" Thomas Greer looked at him levelly. "In it," he said, "around 9:45. I had a rope that needed checking on the stage left side. Takes me past the dressing rooms." "And did you see anything? Anyone?" Greer was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of evasion, more the quiet of a man organizing what he had seen into words. "There was someone at the end of the corridor," he said, "near Miss Ashcroft's door. I didn't think anything of it at the time. People are in and out of that corridor all evening. But they were standing very still, just standing there." "Can you describe them?" "Not well. The light at that end is poor. Medium height. Dark coat, I think. Who could have been a man or a woman? I couldn't say with certainty." "And when you passed, were they still there?" "No, they were gone." Poirot thanked him. He walked back along the corridor toward the dressing room, which was now sealed and guarded, and stood outside it for a moment in the inadequate light, thinking, medium height, dark coat, standing very still outside a dead woman's door at 9:45 in the evening. The performance had ended at 9:30, which meant that whoever had been standing in that corridor had been there within 15 minutes of the curtain call. Within 15 minutes of Vivian Ashcroft walking off stage for the last time, Poirot rubbed the side of his face with one hand, a gesture his housekeeper would have recognized as indicating that the little grey cells were engaged in something that had not yet resolved itself into clarity, and looked at the closed door with its brass nameplate and its printed card in its elegant font. He was tired. It was nearly midnight. His feet ached in the way that they increasingly did on cold evenings. And he had not, after all, intended to spend this night investigating a murder. He had intended to watch a play and go home and drink a small glass of something warm and sleep. Instead, he was standing in a drafty backstage corridor with a dead woman on the other side of a door and a collection of interviews in his memory that had given him several interesting pieces, and no clear picture of how they fit together. Some people never stop. He put on his hat. He would sleep. Tomorrow, with fresh eyes and the particular clarity that came after a night's rest, he would begin to see the shape of it. Or so he told himself. The language of flowers. He did not sleep particularly well. This was not unusual. Poirot had never been a heavy sleeper. His mind had always possessed the inconvenient habit of continuing to work after the rest of him had requested that it stop, turning things over in the dark with the quiet persistence of a river working at a stone. In his younger years, he had found this irritating. Now, in his 60s, he had arrived at a kind of resigned acceptance of it, the way one accepts weather. He lay in the dark of his flat on Whitehaven Mansions and thought about a crushed flower. Not about the broken mirror. That was dramatic, certainly, and had its own significance. But it was the flower that kept returning to him. The mirror spoke of rage, of violence, of a moment that had gone beyond control. But the flower had been placed. Deliberately. After the fact, or during it, or before it, he could not yet say with certainty, but placed with intention, with the specific intention that it be found and understood. By whom? By Vivian Ashcroft herself, if she had been alive to see it? Or by whoever found her afterward? Or, and this thought arrived quietly and settled with considerable weight, by whoever came after? He was still considering this when morning arrived grey and damp through his bedroom curtains. And he rose, dressed with his usual care, ate his breakfast with his usual precision, and telephoned Barnaby at Scotland Yard at 8:45. Barnaby met him at 10 o'clock in a small office at the Yard that smelled of old paper and cold radiators, is with a file on the desk between them that was already thicker than one night's work might suggest. Cause of death confirmed, Barnaby said without preamble. Strangulation. The surgeon puts the time of death between 9:35 and 10 o'clock, which fits with the timeline. She came off stage at 9:30. Edith Marsh found her at 10:30. And the mirror? Struck with the base of a heavy perfume bottle. We found it on the floor beneath the dressing table, behind the larger fragments, crystal, heavy thing. One blow from the front. Poirot considered this. She was seated when the mirror was broken? Almost certainly, the angle suggests it. So the mirror was broken while she was in the chair. Either before her death, perhaps to distress her, to disorient her, or after as an act of… He paused, is searching for the right word. Symbolic conclusion. Barnaby looked at him. Symbolic. Yes, Poirot said simply. That is the word I mean. He opened the file and looked at the photographs that had been taken of the dressing room. His eyes moved to the Narcissus. The flower, he said. Has anyone looked into it? It's a Narcissus, Barnaby said, common enough. Florists all over London sell them. That is not what I mean, Poirot said patiently. He looked up from the photograph. Barnaby, are you familiar with the Victorian practice of floriography? Barnaby's expression suggested he was not, and furthermore that he was not entirely certain he wished to be. The language of flowers, Poirot said. It was a practice, very popular in the 19th century, persisting in certain circles well into this one, of communicating meaning through the choice of specific flowers. A red rose means one thing, a white lily means another. Every flower carried a message if one knew how to read it. And a Narcissus? Poirot was quiet for a moment. A Narcissus, he said, means egotism, vanity. In the old language, the language that educated people of a certain generation would have known, a Narcissus sent to someone was not a compliment. It was an accusation. The office was very quiet. It was a message, Barnaby said slowly. Not merely a message, Poirot said. An indictment. Someone who knew that language, someone who had been educated in it or had deliberately learned it for this purpose, left that flower for Vivian Ashcroft. They wished her to know, in whatever final moments she had, that they saw her, that they had always seen her. Not the performance, not the beauty, or the talent, or the fame, the thing underneath all of that. He set the photograph down. And they crushed it, he said quietly, because they wished her crushed. It was Barnaby who found the letter, or rather, it was one of Barnaby's constables who found it in the course of the thorough search of the dressing room that continued through the morning, and who brought it to Barnaby, who telephoned Poirot at 11:30 with the particular tone of a man who does not like surprises, but has learned to process them efficiently. Poirot was at the Yard within the hour. The letter was not, in the conventional sense, a letter. It was a card, the small kind that accompanies flowers, or the sort one finds tucked into a bouquet from a florist with a few words in ink. It had been found tucked beneath the overturned vase on the dressing table, partially concealed by a fallen powder brush. And it had escaped the initial examination of the scene because it was small and because the larger drama of the room had drawn the eye elsewhere. Poirot held it carefully by its edge and read it. The handwriting was neat, not the careless scrawl of someone writing quickly, but the deliberate, controlled hand of someone who had written with full awareness that what they wrote might be read by others eventually. 4 words only, in dark ink on pale card. You know what you did. No signature, no date, no other mark. Poirot read it twice, and then he set it down on the desk and sat back in his chair, and looked at the ceiling for a long moment with the expression of a man in whom several things are beginning, very slowly, to align. You know what you did. Not I know what you did, which would have been an accusation from outside, a threat from someone who had discovered something. But you know, addressed directly to Vivian, confirming that whatever this referred to, it was something Vivian Ashcroft already carried. Something she had always known. Something that had been done and not forgotten by the person who sent this card. The flower came with this card, Poirot said. It was not a question. We believe so, Barnaby said. The vase on the dressing table. It had contained flowers. Recently. The water was still fresh when Welch arrived, and whatever was in that vase had been put there that evening. And removed, Poirot said. The Narcissus on the floor. It was not from the vase. The vase had held multiple stems from the water stain. The Narcissus on the floor was a single flower, placed separately. He looked at the card again. So, he said slowly, someone sent flowers to Vivian Ashcroft's dressing room before the performance. Flowers that included this card. The flowers from the vase were disposed of or taken away at some point, and a single Narcissus was brought, separately, deliberately, and left on the floor. By the killer, Barnaby said. By the killer, Poirot agreed, who wished to be certain the message was understood, who was not content with the card alone. He stood and walked to the window. Outside, London went about its grey November business with characteristic indifference to the small room above it, where 2 men were trying to understand why a woman was dead. You know what you did. What had Vivian Ashcroft done? And to whom? Old wounds, new poison. The answer, as answers in Poirot's experience so frequently did, began not with a dramatic revelation, but with a conversation that appeared on its surface to be about something else entirely. It began with Edith Marsh. Poirot visited her at her lodgings in Pimlico on the afternoon following the murder, a neat, narrow house in a neat, narrow street, the kind of house that apologizes for nothing and pretends to nothing and gets quietly on with the business of being what it is. Edith Marsh answered the door herself, still in black, still carrying the slightly displaced quality of someone whose ordinary life had been interrupted so fundamentally that they had not yet worked out how to resume it. She made tea without being asked. Poirot accepted it without being asked whether he wanted it, which he appreciated. There was a particular kind of English instinct for tea in crisis that he had come over many years in this country to find genuinely comforting. They sat in her small front room with its carefully arranged photographs and its single window overlooking the street. And Poirot, who had come with a specific question, began instead with something adjacent to it. This was technique, but it was also something more than technique. He had found consistently that people told you what you most needed to know when they believed they were telling you something less important. You were with Miss Ashcroft for nearly 11 years, he said. That is a considerable time. It is, Edith said. She held her cup in both hands. I came to her in 41, during the war. She was doing a touring production, not West End. Nothing glamorous, just keeping the theatres running. She needed a dresser, and I needed the work, and that was that. She was different then, perhaps, before the great success. Edith considered this carefully. She was always Vivian, she said, which Poirot recognized as a complete answer, disguised as a partial one. The success, it didn't change her exactly. It confirmed her. She'd always believed she was exceptional. The success just gave her the evidence. And others believed it also. Most did. A pause. Some didn't. Poirot set down his cup. "Tell me about Dorothy Sims," he said. Edith Marsh looked at him over the rim of her cup with the expression of a woman who had been waiting for this particular question and had spent some time deciding how to answer it. "What do you want to know?" she said. "I do everything," said Poirot simply, "from the beginning." It had begun, Edith told him, 4 years ago. Dorothy Sims had come to Gerald Foss's attention in 1948, a young actress of genuine talent, trained at RADA, with the kind of raw, unpolished quality that experienced directors sometimes valued above the more finished product. Foss had cast her in a small production at the Haymarket, a supporting role, nothing significant, but enough to be noticed. She had been noticed. The notices, in point of fact, had been remarkable. Several critics had mentioned Dorothy Sims by name in reviews that were ostensibly about the production as a whole, which was the theatrical equivalent of a very loud announcement. Foss had taken note. Other directors had taken note, and Vivian Ashcroft had taken note. Vivian read those reviews, Edith said. She read everything written about the theatre always. She said it was professional due diligence, keeping up with the field. But she had a particular way of reading reviews that mentioned other actresses. I'd been with her long enough to see it. And how did she read those reviews? Poirot asked. Very quietly, Edith said. Vivienne was loudest when things didn't concern her. When something touched her, really touched her, she went quiet. She felt threatened. Edith was careful here. I wouldn't say she'd have used that word, but yes. What followed, Edith described with the measured reluctance of a woman who was loyal to a dead employer, but was also, Poirot sensed, quietly relieved to finally tell someone the truth of it. Vivian Ashcroft had, through channels that were never explicitly traceable to her, and begun a systematic and patient campaign to damage Dorothy Sims's reputation within the London theatre world. It had not been dramatic. It had not been obvious. It had been the kind of thing that left no fingerprints because it operated entirely through suggestion and implication, and the careful placement of doubt in the right ears at the right moments. A word here, charming girl, such a shame about her reliability. And a word there. I've heard the directors find her rather difficult. Not that I'd say so myself. And a quiet suggestion to a particular journalist that the young actress's notices had been somewhat exaggerated relative to her actual performance. Nothing that could be proven. Nothing that could be confronted directly. But effective. Quietly, patiently, devastatingly effective. Dorothy Sims had found that over the course of approximately 18 months, that the promising trajectory of her career had flattened. Roles she had expected to be considered for went to others. Calls from directors became less frequent. The warm notices of 1948 began to feel like something that had happened to a different person, in a different life. Did Dorothy know? Poirot asked. Not at first, Edith said. These things are difficult to see when you're inside them. But eventually, yes, I believe she came to understand. How? Edith set down her cup, because Vivienne told her. Poirot was still. Not directly, Edith continued, not in so many words, but they were at a party. This was perhaps 2 years ago, maybe a little less. And Vivienne said something to Dorothy. I wasn't close enough to hear it. But I saw Dorothy's face afterward. And she looked, Edith said slowly, the way people look when something they have suspected for a long time is finally confirmed. Not surprised. Past surprised. Something harder than surprised. Poirot walked back from Pimlico to his flat. He did this partly because the afternoon had turned unexpectedly dry, and he felt the need for air, and partly because he thought better when he walked, a fact he rarely admitted, as it somewhat undermined his preferred image of himself as a man who did his finest work seated comfortably with a cup of tisane. But the truth was that the movement helped, and today particularly, he needed the help. He believed, the motive now. Dorothy Sims had known what Vivian Ashcroft had done to her career, had known it with certainty for at least a year, possibly two. I had accepted, perhaps, a role in the same production as the woman who had systematically dismantled her prospects. Why? To be close to her? To watch her? To wait? Some people never stop. Even when you think it's finished, they never stop. Vivian had said this to Marcus Hale on the evening of her death. Poirot had been turning this over since he first heard it. And now, with the history Edith had given him, it arranged itself into something new. Vivian had not been speaking about a critic or a journalist. She had been speaking about Dorothy. Dorothy Sims, who had not stopped, who had come back, not fled, not retreated into a different life, but come back into Vivian's orbit with the particular patience of someone who had decided that waiting was worthwhile, who had taken a supporting role in the same West End production, and who had spent 6 weeks watching Vivian Ashcroft from the stage every night, with that expression that was not admiration and not resentment, but something that had moved past both of those into something quieter and more certain. It fit. It fit with a completeness that Poirot recognized, the particular satisfying alignment of pieces that had been disordered and now were not. He was almost at Whitehaven Mansions when he stopped on the pavement. A woman with a small dog looked at him curiously as she passed. He did not notice. He was thinking about the letter. You know what you did. He had assumed, had he not, that the letter was from Dorothy to Vivienne. The accusation of someone wronged, sent to the person who had wronged them. It had seemed so obvious, so perfectly consistent with everything else, that he had not. He stood very still on the pavement. He had not, he realized, with the particular uncomfortable clarity of a man catching himself in an error, actually questioned that assumption. He had taken the shape of the thing and placed the letter into it without asking whether the letter itself confirmed the shape, or whether he had simply made the shape fit the letter. You know what you did? What if it was not from Dorothy? What if Vivian had wronged more than one person? What if the campaign against Dorothy Sims was not the only thing Vivian Ashcroft had done in 38 years of protecting her position, her reputation, her exceptional and carefully maintained self? Poirot resumed walking, more quickly now, and the small grey cells that had been moving at a steady pace shifted into something considerably more urgent. He had been, he acknowledged to himself with the honest self-assessment that he considered essential to good detective work, somewhat hasty. He had found a motive that fit and had begun to settle into it with a comfort that was not yet warranted. Dorothy Sims was still the most compelling suspect. The history was real, the motive was real, the opportunity was there. She had been in the building, she had been backstage. She could not account for every minute of her evening with certainty. But comfort, in Poirot's experience, was the investigator's most reliable enemy. The moment you became comfortable with a solution, was the moment you stopped looking for the one that was actually correct. He needed to look harder. He needed to look at what else Vivian Ashcroft might have done. And he needed, what he thought, rubbing his face with one hand in the way that meant the grey cells were working hard and had not yet finished, to speak with Dorothy Sims again. Not the composed, careful Dorothy of the previous evening's interview. The Dorothy who had been standing in that corridor during the second act watching. He needed to ask her what she had seen. The mirror never lies. He telephoned Dorothy Sims the following morning. She answered on the third ring, her voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone who had spent the intervening day composing themselves and was reasonably satisfied with the result. She agreed to meet him without hesitation, which Poirot noted, not as evidence of innocence necessarily, but as evidence of something. Guilty people sometimes agreed to meetings with equal ease, either because they were confident or because they calculated that refusal would draw more attention than compliance. They met at a small cafe in Covent Garden. Dorothy's suggestion, which Poirot accepted. Neutral ground, public, the choice of someone who wanted witnesses to a conversation, which could mean several things, and he did not yet know which, and she was already there when he arrived. Sitting at a corner table with a cup of coffee she had not touched, wearing a dark blue coat and the same expression of careful composure he had observed the previous evening. Up close, in daylight, without the particular pressures of the previous night's circumstances, Poirot found himself revising his assessment of her slightly. She was not merely composed, she was controlled. There was a difference. Composure was a natural state. Control was something you maintained actively, with effort, because without it, something else would show. He sat down, ordered tea, looked at her pleasantly. "Miss Sims," he said, "I am going to be direct with you this morning, if you will permit it. I find that directness, while occasionally uncomfortable, it saves a considerable amount of time that might otherwise be spent on pleasantries." Dorothy looked at him steadily. "Be direct, then." "I know about what Vivian Ashcroft did to your career," Poirot said. "I know about the Whisper campaign. I know that you eventually understood what she had done and why. I know that you have known this for at least a year, possibly longer. I am not telling you this to distress you. I am telling you because I need you to understand that concealment on this point is no longer useful to either of us." Something shifted in Dorothy's face. Not collapse, nothing so dramatic, but a very slight loosening of the control, as if a single thread had been released. "How did you find out?" she said. "It does not matter how. What matters is what you do with the fact that I know." A silence. Dorothy looked at her untouched coffee. "I didn't kill her," she said. The words came out flat and direct, without the particular emphasis of someone trying to convince. More like someone stating a fact they are tired of carrying alone. "Tell me," Poirot said. She had known, Dorothy told him, for 14 months. The confirmation had come not from Vivian directly. Edith Marsh's account had somewhat simplified the complexity of that evening, but from a director named Paul Ashton, who had been sufficiently drunk at a function in September of last year, to tell Dorothy, with the mournful honesty of the genuinely intoxicated, that he had heard things about her from a source he trusted, and that those things had influenced his casting decisions, and that he had recently come to understand the source was not as trustworthy as he had believed, and he had not named Vivian explicitly. He had not needed to. "And what did you do with that knowledge?" Poirot asked. "I was angry," Dorothy said simply. "For a long time, I was very angry. I won't pretend otherwise." She paused. "And then I decided I had two choices. I could walk away from all of it, the theatre, London, the career I'd worked for since I was 17, Or I could stay and prove that she hadn't succeeded, that whatever she'd done hadn't finished me. So you accepted a role in her production. Gerald Foss offered it to me. He's a decent man. I don't think he knew the full extent of what Vivian had done. He saw the role and thought of me and offered it, and I said yes. A slight pause. I wanted her to see me every night, standing on the same stage. I wanted her to know that I was still there. That is, Poirot said carefully, a considerable amount of restraint for someone with considerable cause for anger. Dorothy looked at him directly. I'm not a violent person, Mr. Poirot. Very few people believe themselves to be, until circumstances arrange themselves in a particular way. I didn't kill her, Dorothy said again. Same flat, tired tone. I wanted to humiliate her. I wanted to succeed and have her watch me succeed and know that she had failed to stop me. That is what I wanted. Not, she stopped. Not that. Poirot regarded her for a long moment. Something in the quality of her stillness, the particular tiredness behind the control, the absence of the performative quality that guilty people so frequently and unknowingly displayed. He believed her. He was not certain, and he was not yet ready to be certain, but he believed her. There is something else, he said. I need you to tell me about the second act. You were watching Vivian during your scenes together. I observed this from the audience, and during the interval, you went backstage. I know this because Thomas Greer saw you near the corridor at approximately 9:45. Dorothy went very still. You said nothing of this last night, Poirot said, without particular accusation. I was frightened, Dorothy said. I knew how it would look. Tell me now. She had gone backstage during the interval, not the late interval, but the first, between Acts 1 and 2. She had seen from the stage something that had disturbed her sufficiently to seek a different view of it. From her position in the wings during the first act, she had observed someone near the backstage entrance, the side door that opened onto the alley behind the theatre, who had no obvious reason to be there. Who? Poirot said. I don't know, Dorothy said. That's the honest answer. I saw a person. I couldn't see clearly from the wings, but something about the way they were standing. Standing how? She thought about it. As if they were waiting, she said, not moving through, not working, just waiting and watching the corridor toward the dressing rooms. And at 9:45, when Thomas Greer saw you? I'd gone back to look again, during the second act when I was off stage. I wanted to see if they were still there. And were they? No, they were gone. She paused, but Miss Ashcroft's dressing room door was closed. It had been open when I passed at the interval. Poirot set down his teacup with more care than the action strictly required. You are certain of this? The door was open at the interval, Dorothy said. At 9:45 it was closed. I noticed because I was looking. Poirot returned to Scotland Yard that afternoon with this new information, and a developing picture that had begun to rearrange itself in ways he found both clarifying and troubling. He spread what he had before Barnaby, with the systematic thoroughness of a man laying out the pieces of something he was about to reassemble. The timeline, as it now stood. Vivian Ashcroft had come off stage after the curtain call at 9:30. She had gone to her dressing room. Someone had been waiting, in the building near the corridor, before the performance ended. The dressing room door, open at the interval, had been closed by 9:45. Edith Marsh had arrived at 10:30 to find it open again. The door was closed between 9:45 and 10:30, Poirot said. The killer was in that room during that window. They closed the door for privacy. When they left, they did not, or could not, lock it from the outside, and they left the Narcissus. Dorothy Sims was in the corridor at 9:45, Barnaby said. His tone was careful. She was, Poirot agreed, and she saw the door closed, which means, if she is telling the truth, that she was in the corridor while the killer was already inside the room. She did not go in. She did not see who was inside. She left. If she's telling the truth. Yes, Poirot said. If. He was quiet for a moment. Barnaby, he said, I want to look at something. The flowers that were in the vase. The bouquet, not the single Narcissus. Has anyone traced where they came from? Barnaby checked his file. Constable asked at the florist's near the theatre. One on St. Martin's Lane sold a mixed bouquet yesterday afternoon. White flowers, including narcissus stems. The person who bought them, he paused reading, was described as a woman. Middle-aged, well-dressed, paid cash. Not Dorothy Sims. Dorothy Sims is 26, Barnaby said. No, Poirot said slowly. Not Dorothy Sims. He sat forward. Barnaby, I need everything you can find on Vivian Ashcroft's history. Not the theatre history, the personal history. Before the West End, before the success. Who she was before she became who she was. Barnaby looked at him. You think this goes further back? I think, Poirot said carefully, that the card said you know what you did. Not you know what you did to me. It is a small distinction, and I almost missed it entirely, which I am not proud of. But it is there. He tapped the file. Dorothy Sims is 26 years old. Whatever Vivian Ashcroft did to her career began 4 years ago, when Dorothy was 22. Vivian was 34. So Dorothy Sims is not the only person Vivian Ashcroft has ever wronged. She is simply the most recent one we know about. And the woman at the florist, Poirot paused, was middle-aged, well-dressed, which tells us something about her. And the handwriting on that card, controlled, deliberate, the hand of someone who had written it knowing it might be read by others, that is not the handwriting of uncontrolled anger. It is the handwriting of someone who has been carrying this for a very long time. The office was quiet. Old wounds, Barnaby said. Yes, Poirot said, old wounds. And I have been so occupied with the new ones that I nearly missed them entirely. It was Barnaby's sergeant who found it at 7 o'clock that evening in a collection of theatre records from the early 1940s held at the British Theatre Archive on Floral Street. The particular kind of unglamorous documentary work that solved more crimes than any amount of brilliant deduction. A fact Poirot acknowledged freely and without embarrassment. A production from 1941. A touring company. A cast list. 2 names on that cast list are side by side in the secondary roles. Vivian Moore, she had not yet taken the name Ashcroft that came later, with the marriage and the reinvention, and beside it, Clara Holt. A note in the company records, written in the cramped hand of a stage manager long since retired. V. Moore given lead role previously assigned to C. Holt following director's decision, October 14th. C. Holt left production. Poirot read this 3 times. Then he looked up at Barnaby. Clara Holt, he said, find her. They found her in 40 minutes. Clara Holt, née Pemberton, now Mrs. Clara Whitmore, residing at an address in Kensington, 61 years old, formerly an actress, retired from the profession in 1942, the year following the touring production, never to return. Currently widowed, living alone, described by her neighbours as a quiet or private woman who kept her garden beautifully and received few visitors. Well-dressed, Poirot thought. Middle-aged, or rather, of the age to have appeared middle-aged to a young florist's assistant, in the way that all people past 50 appear middle-aged to those who are not yet 30. She would have been 26 in 1941, Barnaby said, same age as Dorothy Sims is now. The symmetry of it settled over Poirot like something heavy and cold. A young actress, 26 years old, whose role had been taken from her by a woman who wanted it more and was less troubled by the means of getting it, who had left the profession entirely, who had spent 35 years in the ordinary life that had been left to her when the life she had wanted was removed, and who had somewhere, at some point, decided that this was not something she could continue to carry in silence. You know what you did. She knew the language of flowers, Poirot said quietly. A woman of her generation and education would have known it. She chose the Narcissus deliberately. She sent the bouquet, the whole bouquet, as the card, as the message. And then she came herself. To the theatre to finish it. He stood. We need to go to Kensington, he said, tonight. What the Narcissus knew. The house in Kensington was exactly as the neighbours had described it. Quiet, private, well-maintained, in the manner of a person who has transferred the whole of their attention onto the immediate and manageable, having long ago accepted that the larger world is not responsive to their wishes. The garden, even in November, had a certain stripped dignity about it. The beds cleared, the borders edged, the bare rose canes tied back, with the patient care of someone who understood that things needed tending, even when they were not flowering. Poirot stood at the gate for a moment before opening it. Barnaby, beside him, said nothing. He had learned, over the years of their intermittent association, that Poirot's pauses before thresholds were not hesitation but preparation, and were best left undisturbed. And the light was on in the front room, a single lamp, visible through the gap in the curtains, casting a warm yellow rectangle onto the path. Poirot opened the gate and walked up to the door and knocked. She answered quickly, too quickly for someone who had not been expecting a caller, which told him something. Or perhaps she had been expecting precisely this, which told him something else and considerably more. Clara Whitmore was a tall woman, still carrying in her bearing the remnants of the particular posture that theatrical training instilled, and that almost never entirely left the body, whatever else life subsequently did to it. Her hair was white and worn simply. Her face was the face of a woman who had been, in her youth, genuinely handsome, and who had aged into something that the word handsome no longer quite covered, something more considered, more settled, as if the years had removed everything superfluous and left only what was essential. She looked at Poirot. She looked at Barnaby. She looked at the warrant card Barnaby held. And then she stepped back from the door and said, "Come in then," in the tone of a woman who has been waiting for a knock at the door for some time, and has, in some private part of herself, been relieved to finally hear it. The front room was neat and warm, and full of the particular quiet of a house occupied by one person for many years. Books on every wall, a fire that had burned down to comfortable embers. On the mantelpiece, a single photograph, a young woman on a stage, caught mid-performance, her face alive with the particular electricity of someone in the act of becoming exactly what they were meant to be. Poirot looked at the photograph for a moment before he sat down. The young woman in it bore, about the eyes and the line of the jaw, a recognizable resemblance to the woman now sitting across from him in the armchair by the fire. 26 years old, perhaps. Bright with a future that had not yet been taken from her. Clara Whitmore followed his gaze to the photograph and said nothing. "Mrs. Whitmore," Poirot said, "I am Hercule Poirot. I think you may have heard of me." "I have," she said. "I read the papers." "Then you will understand that it is not useful at this point to deny what I believe we both already know. I would prefer, if you are willing, simply to talk. I find that talking is generally preferable to the alternative, for everyone involved." Clara Whitmore looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at her hands in her lap, the hands of a woman in her 60s, no longer the hands in the photograph, but bearing still the long fingers of someone built for the stage. "All right," she said, "we'll talk." She had read about the production in September, a small notice in the Times, the kind of brief, enthusiastic announcement that West End productions placed when they wished to build advance interest, and Vivian Ashcroft's name in the first line, and below it the Criterion Theatre, and below that the opening date in October. "I don't know why I read it," Clara said. "I've seen her name in print 100 times over the years. I stopped reacting to it a long time ago, or I thought I had. But this time was different," Poirot said. "This time," she paused, "my husband died in April. We'd been married 30 years. He was a good man, and I was happy, genuinely happy, for most of those years. But when he died, I found myself, for the first time in a very long time, alone with thoughts I'd kept very well managed while he was alive." She said this without self-pity, which made it considerably more affecting than self-pity would have been. "The grief," Poirot said quietly, "removed the insulation." She looked at him with brief, surprised recognition. "Yes," she said, "that's exactly it, the insulation. I read that notice in September, and something that had been insulated for 30 years was suddenly not. She had gone to the theatre, she told them, not with any particular plan. She had gone in the second week of October, to a matinee sitting in the back row, to see her, to see Vivian Ashcroft on a stage, after all the years, doing the thing that Clara herself had been prevented from doing. How was she? Poirot asked. The question was not strictly investigative. He asked it because he genuinely wanted to know, and because he thought Clara Whitmore might need to answer it. A long pause. She was extraordinary, Clara said. The words came out with the plainness of someone stating a fact they have made their peace with. I sat in the back row and watched her, and she was everything she had always been, everything I had wanted to be and might have been, given the chance. A breath, and I thought, 35 years. 35 years she has had this, and I had the other life. The good life, the real life, the life I don't regret. But she took the choice from me. I never got to choose. She chose for me, and she stopped. She never knew, Poirot said softly, or she never cared. Both, Clara said. I think both. She had sent the flowers on the day of the performance. She had gone to the florist on St. Martin's Lane. She had known the theatre district well once, and the geography of it had not left her, and purchased a mixed bouquet of white flowers, Narcissus among them, and had the card written in her own hand and delivered to the Criterion that afternoon. You know what you did. She had not been certain Vivian would understand the card, but the Narcissus, she had been certain about the Narcissus. Vivienne had been a classically educated woman, and the language of flowers had been something both of them had known in their youth, the kind of feminine accomplishment that their generation had been taught alongside elocution and deportment. I wanted her to know, Clara said, before anything else. I wanted her to know that someone remembered, that it hadn't been forgotten. And then you went to the theatre yourself, Poirot said. A silence. Yes, Clara said. In the evening, to the performance. I had a ticket. I bought it when I came to the matinee. I don't know why. I told myself I wouldn't use it. But you did. I went, Clara said. I stood near the side entrance during the performance. I told myself I was just watching. I told myself I would leave. But you did not leave, Poirot said. She was quiet for a very long time. The fire shifted in the grate. Outside, the November wind moved against the window glass with a sound like something trying to get in. She came off stage, Clara said at last, her voice very low. I was in the corridor. She went to her dressing room. The door was open, and she saw me and a pause that carried something enormous inside it. She didn't know me. She looked at me and she didn't know who I was. The room was completely still. 35 years, Poirot said very quietly. And she did not recognize you. She said, "Can I help you?" As if I were a stranger who had wandered into the wrong part of the building, as if I were nobody. Clara's voice remained steady, but the steadiness of it now cost something visible. And something that I had kept managed for 35 years simply stopped being managed. Barnaby, who had been silent throughout, he said gently, "Mrs. Whitmore, I need to ask you directly. Did you enter Vivian Ashcroft's dressing room on the evening of November the 14th? Yes, Clara said. And did you? Yes, she said again, just the one word, carrying everything. She did not elaborate. She did not justify. She sat with her hands in her lap and her eyes on the middle distance, and Poirot thought that she had probably, in some quiet part of herself, known since April, since the grief removed the insulation, that it was going to end somewhere like this. That the weight of 35 years of careful management could not be carried indefinitely, and that when it finally came down, it would come down hard. The mirror, Poirot said. Not an accusation, almost a question. She still didn't know me, Clara said, even then, even in that room. I told her who I was, I told her what she had done, and she looked at me with that face she had, and she said she didn't recall. A pause. She said she didn't recall. The 3 words landed in the room like stones into still water. And the Narcissus, Poirot said, the single flower, on the floor. I had brought it separately, in my coat pocket. I had meant it. I had meant it as the message, the whole message, everything in one flower. She paused. I left it where she could see it, where she would have seen it if... She did not finish the sentence. She did not need to. Barnaby arrested Clara Whitmore with a quietness that matched the quietness of everything else in that room. She stood when asked, put on her coat, the dark coat Poirot noted, was the one Thomas Greer had half seen in the inadequate light of the backstage corridor, and picked up her handbag with the automatic habit of a woman who had spent 35 years in the ordinary life. At the door, she paused and looked back at Poirot, who had remained in his chair. "You knew it wasn't the young one," she said. "The girl in the cast. You knew before you came here." "I suspected," Poirot said carefully. "There is a difference." "What gave it away?" He considered being diplomatic. He decided against it. "The card," he said. "You know what you did. A young woman who had been wronged 4 years ago and was still raw with it, she would have written, 'I know what you did.' The anger would have been immediate, personal, directed outward. But your card was addressed to Vivian's conscience. It assumed that Vivian carried the knowledge of what she had done, that it lived in her somewhere, recognized and suppressed." He paused. Only someone who had waited a very long time writes like that. Only someone who has had years to move from anger into something quieter and more certain. Clara Whitmore looked at him for a moment. Then she nodded once, with the slight inclination of someone acknowledging a point well made, and walked out into the November dark. Poirot sat alone in the room for a few minutes after they left. He looked at the fire. He looked at the photograph on the mantelpiece. The young woman caught mid-performance, bright with everything that had not yet been taken from her. He was tired, not merely the physical tiredness of a long day and a cold evening, though that was present also, it settling into his knees and his feet and the back of his neck in the way it increasingly did. Something more than that. The tiredness that came sometimes at the end of cases that had resolved themselves correctly, and yet could not be called satisfying. Where justice and sorrow arrived together and were impossible to separate. He had solved it. The little grey cells had done their work, as they always did, as he had always trusted them to do. But a woman was dead who had been brilliant and cruel in equal measure, and a woman was arrested who had been wronged and had waited 35 years and had finally, in a moment of grief and recognition and the catastrophic removal of insulation, done something that could not be undone. And somewhere in the middle of all of it was a young actress named Dorothy Sims, who had come back to prove she was still standing, and who was still standing, and who would now have to decide what to do with that. Poirot put on his hat and his coat and let himself out of the house. The garden was dark. The bare rose canes moved slightly in the wind, the careful ties holding them in their patient winter positions, waiting for a spring they would reach regardless. He walked to the gate and opened it and stood for a moment on the pavement under the street lamp, looking back at the house with its one warm light still burning in the front room. A narcissus means vanity, he thought. It means egotism. It means look only at yourself. But it also meant something else, if you went back far enough. Back to the old story, the original one, of before the language of flowers and the Victorian parlours and the carefully chosen bouquets. Back to the myth itself. Narcissus had not simply been vain. He had been incapable of seeing anyone else, incapable of recognizing the people in front of him, their reality, their worth, their claims upon his attention. He had looked and seen only himself, and the people around him had ceased to exist. And in the end, the pool had shown him only what he had always chosen to see. She said she didn't recall. Poirot turned up the collar of his coat against the November cold and walked away down the quiet Kensington street, his footsteps steady on the pavement, the lamplight following him in small warm pools from post to post, until the darkness between them finally closed. The curtain at last had fallen, and this time, if there would be no curtain call,